Hey, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to the channel. If you clicked on the video, I'm sure you're here to learn about the top 5 tips and tricks that I can give you if you're going to start playing Dice Throne at a high level. Now, to give some context as to why you should listen to me, I have been playing Dice Throne for quite a while. I even won the Dice Throne World Championship that they held in Vegas back a couple years ago, and I've been playing in a lot of their local tournaments ever since. And for those of you that may not know, they have started doing tournaments. They started a little bit ago, but they're becoming a little more consistent. I'm really hoping they grow it into more, but I'll probably make a video about that later. But before I get too rambly, let's go ahead and jump into number 1. Now, the tips themselves are not in any particular order, but I did put this one at tip number 1 because it is the easiest thing you can do to quickly improve your game even just a little bit, and it all has to do with this card right here, Getting Paid, okay? This card seems pretty harmless, right? It's a red card, 0 CP, you play, you gain 2 CP, okay? We love that, that's great, that's awesome. The key to this card is do not play it until you need it. Why do I say that? Well, in really any kind of competitive game, a lot of what it boils down to is information. You want to know what your opponent has, what they don't have, what they can and can't do, and I'm going to have larger videos talking about things like information hiding, presenting information, faking information, things like that. However, this card is the easiest way to lull opponents into a false sense of security. If you end your turn and you have no CP, this might come back to be a tip later, then the other player instinctively knows in their head, okay, well, more than likely this person can't do anything to my dice, so I can roll a little more dangerously, I can freely mod into an ult, something like that. If you happen to be holding a Getting Paid and a So Wild, all of a sudden you went from 0 CP 2 cards and your opponent feeling safe to, oh, well, I just got modded out of my, mini ultimate to a complete whiff, and just they had no idea, and maybe they wasted cards, things like that, right? There is no reason to be playing Getting Paid unless you are using the CP. Now, obviously, if you have more cards than you can be holding and you have to sell down, it's better to play Getting Paid than selling a card, right? Things of that nature. But in most cases, you should not be playing this card until you actually need that 2 CP. Moving on to tip number 2, one of the biggest things you can do and one of the biggest things or mistakes that I see new players make is not looking at their numbers and symbols at the same time whenever keeping dice for a roll. What do I mean by that? Well, using what we can see here with Captain Marvel, she's got a pretty easy to roll board for the most part, it's nothing too crazy, and let's say you get a roll like this. Well, there's a few options, right? You can look for a 6 for Inner Light, you're not terribly far away from an Aurora Wave, there's a lot of different options, but let's say you decide, okay, I want to keep 2 of my white symbols, my photons, and then 1 of my 6, my Holostar, alright? You could, as a newer player, make the whoopsie mistake, and this sounds simple, but it's a super easy mistake to make, of saying, all right, I will keep these 3 and roll these 2. Now, while this doesn't seem like a mistake at first, because if you're looking for Inner Light, Aurora Wave, things like that, you're not ruining your chances by doing what we just did. This makes a lot of sense, right? Like you're keeping things for those. However, a very simple thing to help you out is simply switching this 3 for this 2. What have we done differently? Where our symbols have stayed the exact same, so our likelihood of hitting something like Inner Light or Aurora Wave with this roll has not changed at all. However, we've now added the possibility of if this roll hits 4-5, we now have a large straight. Whereas previously, if we kept 3-3-6, and let's say these top 2 dice conveniently hit a 4-5, now it's a small straight, whereas we could have had a large straight otherwise. So always keep in mind whenever you're keeping dice that you shouldn't just lock into one thing and keep your options open and keep your options available, right? And the best advice I can give for this, if you're, not super into the weeds and you're not super comfortable with it yet, is if you're keeping symbols, there's almost no reason, except for some niche cases, to keep the same number of a symbol, right? Like me keeping 2 3s and a 6 here does nothing for me. Yes, there's the small chance, I guess, if you're looking for Photon Punch of getting 4 of a kind, but if you roll into that, you're already not super happy anyway, so you'd much rather keep a 2-3 and have a chance of hitting your large straight, right? Something like that. Again, there's some niche cases where maybe if there's a on X of a kind, you might in that case keep it, but on average for almost all characters, you're going to want to pay attention and typically keep different numbers where you can lean into possibly hitting a straight while still rolling for whatever that initial ability is that you got close to or that you're looking for. Now for my third tip, again, this is a pretty easy one to follow and try to use, but try not to end your turn with 0 CP. It's not the end of the world if you do, if first turn you have a really good 2 CP upgrade and you're going first, it probably doesn't hurt to do that if you don't have other dice mods you're looking at. However, if you go into your opponent's turn and you have 0 CP, and especially if you have 0 CP, 0 cards, your opponent gets free reign. If they happen to be holding a twice as wild and hit 2 6s on their first roll, they know for a fact, oh, well, I can just fully commit to hitting 1 more 6, which is not that unlikely because you're rolling 6 more dice at that point in order to get that ultimate that you can't change. Now, going with the first tip, you can end your turn with 0, especially if you're holding and getting paid. At that point, it's kind of almost encouraged to because you can bait your opponent in, but in general, it's good to, if you have a card in hand that you don't think you're going to use, go ahead and sell it and have that CP. You can threaten things like a helping hand, you can threaten things like tip it, even with just a single CP in your, bank to use. Now, when it comes to you having 0 cards going into your opponent's turn, this one's a little harder to control as sometimes you just have to use the card for whatever case. But let's say you're sitting on 2 CP and you're holding 1 card in your hand. Now this card is maybe a useless upgrade that you don't plan on playing anyway. If that is the case, don't just sell it for the CP. Keep it in your hand. Like I talked about at the very beginning, a lot of competitive games require information or revolve around the idea of the flow of information. If you're holding a card, your opponent is always threatened, unless you've already played it, that this could be, as we talked about, a helping hand, a tip it, a so wild, any of those cards you can afford. So if you don't need to sell that card for that CP right then, or you're not going to have a use for it, just keep it in your hand. The more information that you can hide from your opponent and the less info that you can give them, the better off you're going to be because they have to take more risks and make inherently worse decisions. Our second to last tip is one that is more of a broad idea, and it's going to be about these 8 cards right here. If you don't know, these are the 8 cards in Dice Throne that every single character gets, no matter what. It doesn't matter. Some characters are going to get cards that alter dice that are their own cards, but these are the 8 that are, everyone has them, every single game, both people have them, great, we love that. These are also divided into 2 very distinct groups. These 4 that you see on the left are going to be cards that can affect your opponent's dice. These on the right are going to be cards that can affect your dice. Now, to be clear, 3 of these ones on your left side also can affect yours, but it's just important to note that only these 4 are going to affect your opponent's dice. Now, why is that important? That is important because forcing a whiff on your opponent, which means for them not to activate an ability, is typically much, much stronger than you amping up an ability. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say you roll a small straight, and you have something like a So Wild to force it into a large straight. Is this something you should do? Now, obviously, context is important. If it's like a game-winning play, or if there's a really distinct reason as to why it's happening, then maybe. I can't tell you every single situation. However, on average, if you can use that So Wild to make your opponent whiff rather than just bumping, let's say, your small straight to a large straight, then 100% you should be making your opponent do nothing. Because let's say that small straight to large straight is on average about 3 points of value different. Okay, that's great. It does 3 more damage. That's cool. We use 2 CP to add 3 damage. It's not the worst use of a card, but there's typically better. However, if your opponent is on a large straight and you can So Wild them off of it to nothing, you just turned what was, let's say, their 8 or 9 damage play into a 0 damage play. The difference from forcing a whiff to you maybe getting slightly better is drastic. Now, I do want to be clear that if you are going to whiff if you don't mod, then 9 times out of 10, you want to use it to stop yourself from whiffing, because you whiffing is also crucial. A lot of Dice Throne games can come down to whichever person whiffs first or whiffs more, if that can happen. Sometimes no one will whiff and that's how it goes, but I digress. It's just important to remember that these 4 cards are all you have, and as soon as you spend one of them to either alter your dice or alter your opponent's dice, that is 1 of 4. That's 25%. That is a quarter of all of your options to do something like that. And it's especially important to notice that, let's say you are sitting on a 2, 3, 4, 5, and you roll a 4 or something like that for your last dice. Use a 6-it, not a So Wild, to change the die. And I know this sounds obvious, but it's just things to acknowledge and think about if you have the option between the two. So Again, remember, it's always better to make your opponent whiff rather than just make your ability stronger. However, if you're gonna whiff, it's important to use that, but just don't forget the importance of these cards. For our last and final tip, I did save this one particularly for last because this typically hurts the feelings of a lot of new players because it's what they want to do the most. And I get it. And at the end of the day, the game is meant to have fun. Play how you want to play. I am just here to help you play optimally and play to the best of your ability. That being said, what I'm talking about for our last tip is stop chasing ultimates. Now I know ultimates are cool, they're fun, they hit hard, they're super powerful because your opponent can't react to them, so you can do whatever you want once you roll it. That being said, it is important to understand how unlikely it is to get an ultimate, okay? Especially naturally. Now, obviously there's context for things. Maybe you have a so wild and a twice as wild and a 6-hit and you have enough money to play all of them and then you roll 2 6s. Sure, at that point, it's a little more okay to send it. However, in a lot of cases, I will see new players, they see 2, maybe even 3 6s, and you shouldn't be chasing those 6s. And let me tell you why. Let's give this first example roll for Pyromancer. Now, looking at her board, there are 3 different abilities that use a 6. So we feel pretty good. We're pretty happy with keeping a 6 because she has a lot of things that can do it. Now, one of her abilities, if you know Pyromancer, is a little, it kind of needs Fire Mastery to work to use Combustion. However, I digress. The idea of this is, what happens if we roll this and we decide we want to go for Meteorite? And we're going to assume that we don't have any dice modification cards. If that is the case, our likelihood of hitting an ultimate is a 1 in 6 on every single die, so likelihood of hitting even one of those is unlikely, but let's say we hit even just 1. Then on the next roll, we now have to hit a 1 in 6 twice after hitting the 1 in 6 on the last one. So we'd have to get a 1 in 36 chance even if we go in with 3 6s, which is crazy. Your odds 1 in 36. What I'm trying to get you to recognize is, let's say this is your roll and you're on your last roll and you really want it, but you have no dice mods, and in your brain you're thinking, oh, well, worst case I get a Meteorite. Okay, sure. It's first off a 1 in 36 that you even hit the ultimate. Let's go ahead and get that out of the way. If you do this in 36 games, on average, only one of those games are you going to get what you want. Let's say you're even okay with a mini ultimate. However, there's reasons not to do that. We'll get to that in a second. Your odds are now a lot better because you only need a 1 in 6 out of the 2 dice. So it's like about a 1 in 3 chance that you end up actually getting what you're looking for in that Meteorite. Now, sure, that's great, 1 in 3. So 1 in 3 games, you should be hitting 1 more 6, and that's great. First off, let's be clear, that is 1 in 3 you should. That doesn't mean you will. It might be 1 in 6 games, depending on your luck. The other important thing to remember is if we're following the example of the tip that I just gave you the turn before, your opponent is holding cards to change your dice. So let's say you roll and you end up hitting a 6 and the other one's still a 4 or whatever you want this die to be. Doesn't matter as long as it's not a 6. If they are holding, let's say, a tippet, you're now whiffing. You tried to chase this ultimate, and you know what? Not only did you try to chase this ultimate, but you got darn close. You got 4 out of 5 6s, you're doing your mini ult, you're feeling great, and then they dice mod you to a whiff. Your whole turn is gone, you have dealt 0 damage, you have wasted an entire turn on nothing, and you feel bad. You feel real bad, okay? Now again, there is context. If you have dice changing cards, this might change your situation, but on average, don't chase it because it's just not good. There's even the logic of, let's say you try really hard to roll and assume you don't have cards to change. Let's say you hit the ultimate. If your opponent has a twice as wild, you just whiffed. You just whiffed, and it's just so dangerous. Whereas a lot of times, if you have something like this is Pyroblast, and if they want to force you off a Pyroblast, and let's say they use something like a Helping Hand, well, if you re-roll this, there's a high likelihood you just get it right back. And if you re-roll this, you still have Pyroblast, so it doesn't even matter. So a lot of times it is super dangerous to roll for that ultimate without something to back it up. Also, I'm not going to get super into the weeds of things like your probability and your statistics of actually rolling the ultimate, because that's not what this video is intended for. But even if you get 3 6s, your odds, again, go from a 1 in 36 to it's better than a 2 in 36, but you get 2 chances. It's just, it's easiest to think about it that way, all right? That's not exactly how the math works out, but just think about it that way. You're still so unlikely, and like, I cannot preach this enough to new players, that you need to stop chasing ultimates. Now, there are some characters where it's better than others, and once I start doing character breakdowns, I'm going to talk more about characters that are a little okay with chasing ults. Barbarian is a good example because he likes having more than just 1 6 on a lot of abilities. Moon Elf is another example. Anyway, not to get off track. On most characters, you need to stop chasing ultimates. I know you see those 3 6s and they're super shiny, and on your first roll and you're like, oh, I have such good odds. I basically get 2 rolls on both dice. Like, I have such good odds here. It's just not a good idea. I'm going to be honest with you. If I see this kind of roll and I have no cards in hand, I am probably rolling these 2 dice to hit a Pyroblast or something like that, okay? Obviously character dependent, but on average, stop trying to chase ults. You most of the time will end up whiffing, and then most of the time lose the game. But hey, I know it feels good when you hit it. So there you have it. Those are my 5 tips for new players that are coming into the scene, trying to get better, trying to improve. And again, these were just really focused on simple things that you can do to improve your gameplay, even just a little bit. At the end of the day, Dice Throne is a game of chucking dice. There's a lot of luck, and what makes a good player and a bad player is typically pushing those percentage chances of winning ever so slightly in your favor. One of the beauties of Dice Throne is that a lot of the matchups and things like that are at worst 60-40. All right, your odds of winning are always decent, no matter who you're playing, no matter what the situation. There's always an opportunity and always a chance. So every single percentage point that you can get to push that likelihood of winning even that much more is a huge, huge deal in a game like Dice Throne. So hopefully this helped you out. If you have any tips that I missed, let me know down in the comments. I'm sure I will be doing more tips videos because there are many things you can talk about in a game like this. But I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace out.